thanks for joining us today. Today we have Patrick, is it Crist or Crist?
Crist.
Patrick Crist visiting from Planted Forward in Colorado. So Patrick runs a consulting firm where he oversees an extensive global network of conservation practitioners and planners. And Patrick is specialized in solving wicked problems in conservation, which often occur on the interface between land and sea, and a sustainable use of the resources. And so Patrick has developed many decision support systems for improved assessment and planning, and he'll be talking to us about how to solve wicked problems, I think. So Patrick is around for the rest of the day, so please touch base with him. He'll be sitting in 504. And also, if you wanted to join us for lunch after the seminar, stay after the seminar, we'll go together for lunch. Okay.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Elisa. You know, this is the temple, right, of conservation planning. So great to finally be here. I've been interacting with folks up at JCU. I've known Bob Pressey for about 25 years. So good. I've also interacted with a lot of UQ folks over the years, so it's good to finally be here. Yeah, it's maybe a little strange to be talking about this crisis when we've got a global pandemic going on, financial crash, and losing office space. I mean, that's biggie. So, but we know that a lot of those things will pass, but the coastal crisis is not going to pass. It's going to rapidly get worse and worse. All right, and
just Fed press.
We're on
Right-hand side, Fed press.
I knew we shouldn't have turned it off. All right, should we just do manual advance?
Do you want me to just?
That'd be great.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah, I think we covered a lot of this. Just point out, I started my career as a landscape architect in California. It's great whenever I come to Australia because we use a lot of Australian plants in California. They grow really well there. So anyway, I've had a variety of roles. My newest one is starting at the end of the month with Vera that does the REDD+ standards for carbon sequestration. But we're actually going to be building something called Landscale. That's a new framework for dealing with sustainable development goals at landscape scale, and there'll be an online decision support system associated with that. So stay tuned. Go ahead. Yes. So yeah, in terms of this coastal crisis, I thought it'd be good to define a bit what I'm thinking of here. I don't think any surprises for anybody in this room. You guys know a lot of this stuff. Most people live near the coast around the world. Sea level rise is going to displace millions of people. Governments are not planning for this in general. I know Australia made a run at planning for it, but that's been rolled back. We can't seem to get things off the ground too much in the US, even though we've had, I think the figure was $845 billion in flood losses in the last 10 years or so. We have this other issue too, might be a uniquely US thing, or at least developed countries, where communities just are used to getting bailed out when we have a big event of some sort, and we tend to just rebuild things right where they were to begin with. Starting to slowly change. We're seeing more programs getting people to take a buyout and move rather than rebuild, but I'd say it's still not typical. We're using a lot of stopgap measures right now dealing with coastal problems, so a lot of hardening. As in Hawaii, they're doing a lot of just bags of cement they throw out there and wait till they get wet, and then they turn into a wall. Pretty ugly stuff, but you know, we have to worry about this problem of coastal squeeze, where we're doing hardening and the near shore marine environments want to migrate inland, and they're just going to run into walls. And then thinking about managed retreat, ultimately we're going to have land uses that are going to move, and they're going to be competing both with existing land uses there, because we don't really have anywhere that's not used for something, including conservation is a land use. We also have a habit in the US when we have a crisis, we tend to nullify the environmental regulations, so I can certainly imagine the future where we have to worry about our current inland nature preserves becoming more intensive land uses. So I was reading a report recently, and I think they made a good point that retreat is coming no matter what we do. So it can either take forms of a chaotic post-traumatic event type of retreat, what they call a market-driven retreat. So that's basically a collapse of home insurance, a collapse of real estate markets. So the market is going to dictate your property is no longer worth anything, and people are going to move, and that's going to be very ugly. Or we can have planned retreat, which again, people don't tend to want to talk about right now, but they're going to have to pretty soon. So next. Yeah, so just from Pew Foundation, just saw this headline here. That was the $845 billion in losses from flood damage. Of course, not all immediate coast, but we've also had a lot of severe flooding caused by major precipitation events. Next. And you can just click through these. So I just wanted to put this into a hierarchical framework. So we begin high up with multi-objective planning. You can also consider ecosystem-based management, part of that high-level framework. Then nested within there, we can talk more specifically about coastal zone management and integrated Landsea planning. We delve a little deeper into land and ocean-based threats. So particularly, we're talking about flooding events, including sea level rise, and cumulatively with other stressors and threats to build resilience. And then what I'll focus on more today is data and scenario-driven approaches. So getting into decision support, GIS, but involving stakeholders. And so moving on here, variety of photos of different issues around integrated Landsea planning. Go ahead. So for one, we need to address resource management needs across the realms of terrestrial, freshwater, and marine. And we would do that simultaneously. So we need to break down the stovepipes of how we actually address these management issues. And we also need to address stressors across those different realms. So of course we have direct uses within the ocean, we have direct uses on the land, we also have land-based stressors making their way into the marine areas, and then we have sea level rise and storm surges moving in the opposite direction and impacting land uses on the terrestrial realm. So if we want to integrate cross-realm ecosystem processes, we're going to be looking at freshwater, sediment, nutrient delivery issues. And then there's the stovepipes on the socio-political governance side of things. So we really need to integrate across agencies and policies. Those do tend to be very stovepiped across these realms. And ultimately, we want to reveal co-benefits by doing this work. Of course, there's trade-offs as well, but the trade-offs, again, as probably most of you know, have been pretty one-way. So I just give this example in the US where a couple thousand kilometers up in the upper Midwest of the US, we subsidize a lot of corn growing. There's a huge amount of surplus nitrogen that makes its way into the Mississippi River. That flows down and it creates a huge dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. Massive economic effects on the fishermen, seafood industry down there, but policy-wise, we haven't really connected those things together. Next. Okay, so I'm not going to walk all through a lot of these framework diagrams, but this is one that my colleague Jorge Alvarez Romero with others produced. And so thinking about integrated Landsea planning with a focus on the marine species and ecosystems, some of the direct impacts there, but then working its way this way to talk about impacts from land use in catchments and again how those flow down, but bringing in the political constraints and opportunities. But very importantly, kind of off to the side here, but something we want to pull into the middle are these objectives for other values within the Landsea area. So this is one I put together several years ago. There's a lot of commonality here. This one had more emphasis on stakeholder processes at the top, getting into some of the technology, decision support, and data kind of issues, but the main issue here are these cross-realm process models. So that's how we're really connecting these stressors across these different terrestrial, freshwater, and marine realms. Next. And then you can go ahead and click through, a couple more clicks on this. So this is just taking one of those frameworks and thinking about different software and decision support tools and models of how we can put those together into a scenario-based approach, again, involving stakeholders. And so we can be working across these disciplines of land use planning, tool like community viz, hydrologic modeling with OpenInspect, Vista, I'll talk a bit more about in terms of scenario-based assessment planning. So we can think about how we configure different tools into these interoperating toolkits. Next. So I'll just talk a bit about Vista. The icons there just indicating the breadth that the tool's been applied to. It's been around in release since 2015, so 15 years this month. Go ahead and click it again. So it is an extension to ArcGIS, ArcMap. Probably will work on 10.8, but I haven't tested it myself. I'm using it on 10.7. It's not going to be updated to ArcPro, just want to let people know that. So it's got probably a couple more years of shelf life on it. But basically the idea was to be able to introduce biodiversity conservation to other different kinds of planning sectors in land use and infrastructure and so on, but still have some pretty robust and defensible methods behind it. Next. So the analytical process for Vista begins with the idea of an element. It's basically anything that you can map that you care about, that you want to assess impacts upon, plan for its continued persistence. You can combine those in different ways to get typical sort of weighted overlay indices to explore value. Next. The real meat of it, though, is the scenario-based cumulative assessment process. So you can characterize what's going on in the land, air, and water, as well as policy or causal mechanisms behind those things, and have a variety of scenarios, usually thinking about current baseline situation, build-outs on the land, plan or proposal sort of scenarios. Certainly trends, so looking at climate change trends. You apply the cumulative effects models, you get a lot of different maps and reports out of it. And then you can turn it into an exploration and planning tool, so you can focus on certain areas where it's showing a lot of impact and understand what's going on there, and then actually specify mitigating activities and how you want to implement them. So it does have a wizard to work with MarkSand, so we don't think it's better than MarkSand, it's actually complementary with MarkSand. We didn't try to get into optimization because that's already handled pretty well, but you can bring MarkSand results into what's basically a more refined spatial design and planning and policy environment in Vista. Finally, there's the adaptive management cycle, so it's easy to update things and understand how things might be changing for your plans or alternatives going forward. So now I want to move into some tangible examples of some of this work. So the first thing I'll acknowledge is that there's not a lot that Jorge and I have been able to find that really tackles all of these problems that we want to get into with Landsea planning combined with managed retreat. So we put together a working group on that, and we're looking for more victims to join our working group. Sorry, if you could back up one. If that's easy. If not, it's okay. So yeah, I just wanted to state, I mean, there are a lot of examples of integrated Landsea planning, really good ones that have come out of UQ. Many of these really are looking at how stuff on the land ends up in the marine realm, and then what to do about that. More are starting to incorporate coastal vulnerability and resilience, but what we're not seeing yet is tying all of that together with managed retreat. Okay, next, please. So I'm just going to show this couple slides from this one. So basically, this is in a place in Texas that actually got leveled by Hurricane Harvey. But what we were interested in was comparing a business as usual urban growth model and the runoff that might cause with another urban growth model that could have the same amount of housing and business units and the same amount of economic activity, but produce a lot less stuff ending up in the marine areas. Next. And we could couple that with a lot of socioeconomic indicators as well, so that's part of the multi-objective planning part of this that we were illustrating. Next. So this one I'll go into a little more depth. This is from Puerto Rico, and I'll just acknowledge all the technical work was done by my intern at the time, Samantha Koshishilo. There's a pretty extensive EBM Tools recorded webinar on this if you wanted to see more. Next. So this project was done in collaboration with NOAA and the Puerto Rico DNR. We had been working for many years in Puerto Rico, so we already had a really massive VISTA decision support project for the area, but this added the marine component. This, they call the Northeast Ecological Corridors, basically this area between the main island and these other two islands. Next. And just, looking at some of the elements that we were dealing with, so mangrove, corals, seagrasses, manatee, were all some of the key ones. Of course, we had a lot of land-based biodiversity as well. Next. So in VISTA, this is that first analysis I talked about, so called conservation value summary. It's basically a weighted overlay. And so what we can see from light green to dark green are concentrations of biodiversity elements. This is famous El Yunque, very old rainforest that the Spanish preserved. And so that's the part of the VISTA work, and then we had the NOAA Open Inspect tool, which is also free and just indicating you're basically modeling runoff off the catchments and sediment nutrients. So in coming off, what it doesn't actually do is that, the marine plume, so all the values stop at the shoreline. So we had to figure out how to extend that pollution into these marine plumes. Next. So this is based on some Maris imagery. So just regular imagery, we can clearly see these marine plumes coming out. This is the Maris imagery that actually gets that density of stuff within the plumes, but it doesn't really know what the stuff is. So we basically extrapolated the density of material from the Open Inspect calculation. So basically thinking about milligrams per liter of sediment and nitrogen in particular, and then applying those according to the density in the Maris imagery. Not as scientific as we'd want to be, but actually I thought that was some of the better work that I'd seen to date. Next. So this is just a map of how we bring the stuff into VISTA. So unfortunately there's the gradients in here aren't enough to really see, but we've got the marine plumes, and then we've got the stuff actually where it's coming off of the catchments. Next. And then we can combine it with other stuff. So this is basically land use with reds being urban and light green and yellow being ag type of uses. And then in VISTA, skip several steps ahead, we've got the cumulative effects assessment. So where we have tan colors means everything's okay. Where we have pink to red shades, we've got impacts, basically a measure of non-viability potential of the resources in that area. So we can see a lot going on right in the near shore areas because those plumes. Get a quantification, basically of what percent of these things would be viable. Next. And then we bring in Marxan. And I think this was kind of an interesting take on Marxan. So for the marine part, it was run in a pretty traditional way of trying to optimize how much bang for the buck you can get. So that's going to be the red areas. And the terrestrial, we flipped Marxan on his head a little bit, and so we were interested in capturing as much terrestrial biodiversity as possible, but we actually gave areas of high erosion from the Open Inspect model a very low cost because we actually wanted to drive selection into the areas that need catchment restoration. So we'd be capturing biodiversity where we were also going to be doing restoration work that would then benefit the marine environment, if that makes sense. Next. And so just zooming in again, so these are these areas of impact in the marine area, and they correspond roughly with the mark sand solution, other than kind of right in there. Next. So, in Vista we can select these areas, we can see what's going on in those. Basically inventory of the biodiversity and the stressors and how the biodiversity is responding to the stressors. We can pinpoint that it's this level of sediment that we're getting a lot of negative responses from our elements. And then what we did was we identified an area in the catchment, just one place just to get started, and we could apply an erosion control specification to that. Next. And you can click one more. And then what we did is we fed that polygon back into open-end specs. So this was the before, the brown shades are concentrations of sediment coming off. Basically apply the erosion control, and you can see that basically disappears. Next. And so it's, again, one of these things, it's hard to see the difference in the colors, but the numbers are indicating the drop in the sedimentation within the overall plume area. Now, it's not a really significant drop, but we only worked on this one area, so just to indicate that you can then iteratively select more areas and see how much area you really need to restore until you get that number down low enough to show positive response from the biodiversity. Next. Okay, so that one was all about getting the land-based stressor. How do we figure out where to do work in the catchment to mitigate that while we're also capturing terrestrial biodiversity conservation. I only have this one slide. This is a project in Northern California, Humboldt Bay, and this was a good 10 years ago, so I don't think we'd heard of the term managed retreat back then, but that's what we were trying to demonstrate here. So under I think this was maybe up to a 2-meter sea level rise, but identifying, current airport is going to get inundated. Some initial thoughts about putting it there under it's a maladaptive location. It would also get flooded, so finding another location for it. This area here was zoned for commercial industrial development, but it's actually ag land that they really value there. So just capturing that this is an area that's needed for shallow water habitat migration with sea level rise, and also avoiding putting new development in harm's way, and then relocating the equivalent amount of urban area that would be inundated eventually. Next. Okay, and then we'll now get into one that integrates the hazard part more explicitly. So this was a project we worked on with all those people down there. We had 7 regions, 6 on the US East Coast and then 1 in San Francisco. And this was integrating vulnerability of human assets and biodiversity with the aim of prioritizing where we could do habitat restoration that would also potentially improve human resilience against a whole slew of flooding events, inland-based, storm, ocean-based, and sea level rise. Next. So a university lab is doing the entire set of catchments on all the coasts there. These blue ones are the ones that we worked on called targeted watersheds. Next. And then basic objectives, basically covered that. And then we wanted to really work with the stakeholders. So we had stakeholder groups in each watershed. We had a website. There's this viewer tool the university built, and then a lot of freely downloadable products. Keep going. So yeah, just a quick look at these. So if you wanted to check it out, you can just go there. If you just search targeted watersheds, you'll probably come across it, but this is how people can access it. Pretty detailed reports, and then people can download all the data sets. Go ahead, sorry. And then this is an example of the online viewer. Next. So I just want to walk through using Delaware Bay, so one of these sites, what some of the products look like. That's the location here. Philadelphia is up there, but you can see where it is in the context of the eastern coast. It's quite a large estuary. And this is, again, that conservation value summary. The difference here is a data difference between two states, but basically seeing the diversity of terrestrial and marine species and habitat types. And then just comparing when we add a condition modeling to it, so the difference between basic richness and a condition-weighted richness. Finally, we get into the vulnerability assessment. So this would be for the fish and wildlife. This is based on current baseline conditions combined with flooding threats. I think is the next image. So this is with sea level rise. You can see a lot more vulnerability, so deepening those habitats and then flooding the coastal fringe areas. Next. And then likewise, we did the same for human assets, which don't tend to overlap. So we do see, in some of the urban areas, we'll see some darker red areas, but with a sea level rise in particular, it's a very flat topography there, so seeing a pretty extensive amount of vulnerability. The meat of it really was to take all that data, all those different products, and run it through a weighting model to identify what they were calling resilience hubs. And so the darkest shaded areas in the blues and dark greens are indicating essentially where we have habitat areas that are nearby vulnerable human communities or assets, weighted by a few other factors about condition and how well protected or not they are, adjacency to other conservation areas as candidates for doing this sort of proactive resilience restoration work. Next. And then we have the stakeholders provide existing plans or proposals for restoration work that were intended to have that dual benefit of building human resiliency but improving habitat. Next. And so we could take these footprints provided by stakeholders and we could drill them down through these different map results and characterize each one of these places. All of that with the aim of when there's money available for this kind of work, that the funders could quickly sort through and query the database and find the sort of projects that met their criteria for funding. So some work in progress. Recently, I launched work with Duke University, funded by the Climate Alliance and the Doris Duke Foundation. Very, very similar. It's the coastal area from North Carolina up through New York, so 6 states, and they're focusing on not broadly on biodiversity, but blue carbon marsh restoration, so ecosystem service-based approach. And then the work doing with JCU, some UQ researchers and others, where we really want to figure out how to integrate managed retreat more systematically into these Landsea planning frameworks. We have social science researchers, folks at Stanford, Columbia, and Harvard I've been talking to that are keen to work with us so they can see how their work can mesh with what we're doing, trying to put it in that ecological context. And there's just an example, taking that framework and then starting to identify those areas where managed retreat will probably need some explicit treatment in the framework. Next. Also thinking about more at a site level scale, how we think about as the imminence of threat increases from near term to farther term and severity of loss to whatever people care about goes from low to high, what sort of adaptations might be appropriate at those different stages. Next. So just a few conclusions. One is that we know technically how to do this. There's been a lot of good papers out recently exhibiting different modeling approaches. So it's not that it's hard to do from a technical standpoint, or that we don't have the data. Most places we have data better than at least throwing darts. Next. But again, I think you guys know what the significant challenges are. Political will to fund this kind of work and actually do the planning. A lot of work, again, on the socioeconomic side of landowner willingness and acceptance to participate. It's obviously a tremendously frightening thing for landowners. They're a lot of processes have been shot down because people kind of rise up and say, I don't want you doing anything that's going to point an arrow at my property and say it's going to be worthless eventually. So quite understandable, but we need to figure out how to get a hold of that. So next, I think I just have, thank you. And I have a couple questions there we could talk about if you wish, but otherwise I am happy to take any questions or comments.
Patrick, I was just interested in, so when you were doing the mapping of like the benefits, like for example the fish and the wildlife condition, how did you, like what indicators did you use to map that condition, and did you find that there were co-benefits with them, or did they have trade-offs, so that when you went to do the priority areas, or the priority, what do you call them, the hubs, the resilience hubs, are these areas where it was, you sum them together and you get, cumulative co-benefits, and that was really obvious, or are you having to, identify resilience hubs which are good for fish and which are good for wildlife, and sort of what are the trade-offs in the landscape?
Yeah.
How did you,
Yes, question generally about calculating these resilience hubs, or it was essentially a bit of a prioritization of where those might go, or a ranking. There wasn't really a trade-off done. It treated biodiversity equivalently, so there wasn't any weighting of these taxa are more important than those taxa. So the weighting was really more on the human side, so there was an importance weighting factor on which sort of human features were more important, and it was from basically the people funding this work with NOAA, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, that were concerned not with every single human feature out there, so we didn't have vulnerability of every road, for example. It was really based more on if there was a storm event, which human features were most important for recovery. So they were looking at escape routes and hospitals and fire stations and things like that. And we also had an environmental justice zone to it as well. So mostly it was how those were weighted and how many of those were in a particular area that was potentially buffered by the natural habitat areas. And then all things being equal, then the more biodiversity that was in that location, the better score that it would get. Something, a lot more could be done with it, but that was, the results of the group think on how to approach that problem. Yeah, Dan.
Thanks for the talk, Patrick. It's kind of crazy that this is 15 years old. That's amazing.
And I'm only 29.
A prodigy at 14.
Yeah. No.
My question is about SDGs. You kind of mentioned them at the beginning and at the end, but I was wondering if there's an explicit connection where you're trying to feed into national reporting, or is it a mechanism to try to encourage policymakers to see this in a more positive light? Can you make the connection between the goals and the SDGs?
Yeah, and again, the work hasn't really been done yet, but just last week when we were doing our workshop up on Maggie Island, the group was just trying to think about how do we start. We looked at a ton of different frameworks until we had boxes and arrows coming out of our ears, but we just decided that really with Managed Retreat, we're talking about people and livelihoods and human well-being and all that. So it made sense to think about that's at the center. And then, how are we wrapping these processes around that? So we didn't get as far as diagramming it out yet. So we basically have lots and lots of notes that are getting turned into a white paper, and then on into other products as we move along. But right now what we're interested in is bringing more people in. It's a pretty small workshop, so getting some more brains thinking about it.
Is there a response after the extreme events? I know that we've had some in Australia with big floods in Townsville where lots of houses went underwater and people, couldn't function for weeks and things. Like, does it have short and it's not a
Yeah, the materials I've read, it's pretty mixed. There's actually a good book I've been making my way through called The Geography of Risk that looks at particularly this area of the New Jersey coast and how it ended up developing a lot of the political processes behind the scenes that kept regulations from being put into place to keep people from building in high hazard areas, which were recognized at least as early as the 1940s, I think, and how storm after storm people just thought, well, it's a beautiful place, I love being here, I'll rebuild, but of course a lot of that rebuilding is subsidized by the rest of the U.S. taxpayers because it's federal money, so it's money collected from everywhere that rebuilds those kind of places. There's been some studies over the last few years looking at real estate values in areas that in particular are considered probably threatened by sea level rise, and some studies have detected if not a reduction in value, a slowing of appreciation compared to very similar places in the same region that are not flood threatened. So there's some sense that people are starting to think about that when they're buying homes now. And then the big fear is that, like Florida is really worried they're one major event away from the entire insurance industry just pulling out, which is economic Armageddon in a place like that that's so real estate driven in its economy. If you have a mortgage on your house, you're required to have it insured, and if you can't buy insurance, then what happens to that mortgage? So people are pretty terrified right now. Yes?
So I know in the recent presidential election on the Democratic side, one of the candidates, I believe Elizabeth Warren, proposed some sort of policy idea where project developers would have to disclose any risk due to climate change in all their developments. Do you think that sort of policy where just getting it officially documented on paper is going to would make a lot of progress, or is it that everyone's well aware of it, putting it on paper and disclosing it to shareholders transparently isn't really going to change anything? Do you have any possible opinions?
Are we still recording? Well, you have to disclose if you're in a FEMA, that's our emergency management agency, if you're in a FEMA flood zone. The problem is, and again, that report I had cited some figures out of, they were pointing out some of our really major flooding disasters we've had in the last 5 years. Very large proportion, 30 to 50% of homes that were flooded were not in a mapped flood zone, and so they had no flood insurance whatsoever. So you have to disclose now, but it's really inaccurate information. Certainly I think it's probably important that people understand what the risks are. Whether that's going to happen, I don't know. There's going to be a massive lobby against doing something like that. But, we have I haven't checked recently to see if it's still online, but the NOAA Sea Level Rise Viewer is a publicly available viewer where you can zoom into an area. And it's a little bit coarse, but it's not bad, so you can probably get a general idea if you're looking to buy in an area that's going to be underwater eventually.
Thank you for the talk. I'm curious to know, in this managed retreat type deal, I kind of understand what would happen where you would move people to another place away from the flooded area, and you have to pay some amount of money for that to happen. I'm curious to know what happens to all the infrastructure that's left behind. If that, in examples that you've seen, does it just get left, or does the government pay to rip it out and do restoration, or what happens there?
Some of that, I think I skipped over a point early on that I had on the slides, but I think, again, the economics of this are that we've bailed out communities one after another with different events, but as the events are getting closer together and much larger, that price tag is just getting astronomical. So I think there's a lot of people saying we can't keep this up. And I think one of the first issues is going to be that debris that's left over after a hurricane. I know we've had some places where it's taken some years to remove it all. I believe eventually it's gotten removed. But if we think about 5 major hurricanes happening everywhere all at the same time, that's kind of the equivalent of, sea level rise is going to happen everywhere at once. We're not going to have the money, and so I think that's where we're trying to get proactive about communities planning for this stuff. I believe it's Santa Cruz, California, has also put some managed retreat regulations on the books, along with Maui, Hawaii, where they've got to phase things. That kind of box chart I showed at the end with different strategies for different time frames, they've implemented something kind of like that. So I think the idea is incrementally you're dealing with this problem. So if you're in certain zones, like you can't do improvements or expand or build something new. So I think it's intended to deal with that incrementally. But yeah, I think when there's going to be a big event, we're going to run out of money, and we're just going to have inundated kilometers of rotting, flooded out houses with no funding to deal with them. So the people that have always joked like, well, I'm going to have beachfront property. Well, in between you and the beach is going to be a lot of devastated neighborhoods. Cheery, huh? Yeah.
I wonder, this is an opinion, but I just wonder to what extent those homeowners should take some of the responsibility for that, if they're going to buy the land and then put infrastructure on it. To what extent are they responsible for cleaning up?
Yeah, well, some places are considering making you have a bond when you build new, so they'll pay for that removal. But I think the local governments are looking at a massive legal and financial exposure as well, because they're giving the building permit. I think when people get a building permit, they're assuming the local government has determined it's okay to build there. And I think smart lawyers are going to be able to show there was good enough data to say you should have built there. I think it's going to be a pretty massive problem. Great. Well, thanks again. Great questions. Appreciate it.
If there are no other questions, then please join me